Saranga. Testimonium Flavianum, or Testimony of Flavius. This name may not ring a bell, but probably the name Josephus will. TF is the name given to a brief passage supposedly written by Josephus. That passage is submitted by Christian apologists as the best evidence for the historicity of Jesus. The passage is found in the Antiquities of the Jews as we have it today in Book 18, Chapter 3 and Paragraph 3, or simply in verses 63 and 64. The Antiquities is a monumental 12-volume account of Jewish history from its early beginnings to the revolt against Rome in 66 CE, and it was published shortly after 93 CE. The TF is 5 sentences long, 5 sentences, about someone who reportedly appeared alive on the third day after death, and about someone who allegedly fulfilled all the Jewish prophecies. The TF was taken to be authentic until the 16th century. It was then that scholars began to raise suspicions of it being a Christian interpolation. It is interesting to note that no other passage from ancient literature has been as hotly debated for its authenticity as this one. I will get to the TF in just a minute, but before that, let's see who Josephus is. Josephus was born in 37 CE in Jerusalem and died 100 CE in Rome. In his autobiography, he claimed to have been born of a noble Jewish family and was educated in Greek. As a Jewish military leader, Josephus led the Jewish army in the siege of a Jewish town during the Roman-Jewish War. At one point in the war, he abandoned his army and surrendered to Titus and Vespasian. After this, he was adopted by Vespasian and assumed Vespasian's Gentile name Flavius. Let me tell you that non-Jews were called Gentiles. He settled in Rome with a generous pension that allowed him to write in Greek, the language of the elite in imperial Rome. Josephus held an important position among the royalty of Rome. How do we know this? His negotiation with Emperor Nero for the release of 12 Jewish priests is proof to this fact. Now let me read the 5-sentence passage to you. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold. These and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. The question we are examining in this video is this 5-sentence passage the handiwork of Josephus? If it is not, who wrote it? I will begin the examination with a quote from Paul J. Hopper. He is a renowned American linguist who examined the TF in its original Greek. He says, if the TF were authentically the work of Josephus, it would have massive historical importance since it would be the only known pagan witness to the life of Jesus to have survived from the 1st century of the Common Era. Now Hopper is right, but is it authentically the work of Josephus? Scholars don't think so. The authenticity of the passage has been questioned repeatedly since the 17th century. In the 18th century, Voltaire noted with reference to its authenticity that the backbone of the historicity of Jesus had been pulled away. There are a dozen or so scientific and convincing arguments against TF's authenticity. I will discuss the 3 most cited reasons. Number 1, the brevity of the passage. Now, brevity can be discussed with reference to 2 aspects. First is with reference to Josephus's style of writing. His writing style was far more sophisticated, elegant, and elaborate than the TF indicates. Now, there's a good reason why Josephus went into detailed explanation of every event and concept he described. And that is because who he was writing for and what he was writing about. Josephus wrote specifically for a Gentile audience. He wrote about Judaism and about Rome. To the Jews, he explained Rome, and to the Romans, he explained Judaism. By virtue of his birth and upbringing, he was a Jew, and by virtue of his career, he had easy access and first-hand knowledge of Rome's culture, religion, and politics. This combination made him an ideal candidate for both addressing the Jews and the Greco-Romans, and also for writing about both of them. In accomplishing what he set out to do, Josephus took it upon himself to explain every new phenomenon and jargon of one group to the other. He left nothing to the conjecture of his readers and explained everything in detail. His works showed no signs of scurrying through the text. He dedicated passages after passages in discussing at length the religious and political events, the origin and meaning of religious beliefs and religious sects, the biographies of the people he referred to, so on and so forth. That work ethic of Josephus is seriously lacking in this passage. And while talking about brevity, let me also note that apologists have argued that the passage in its entirety is not a Christian insertion as critics allege, and that Josephus did indeed write parts of it which was then tampered with by Christians. Scholars call this the partial authenticity argument. Now, this argument can be easily refuted through close literary examination. But even if this argument holds water, it only strengthens the brevity argument, proving that Josephus may not have done such a shoddy job about a supposedly miracle-working, death-defying, seemingly divine man. Another important aspect of Josephus's writing style is revealed through the accusation leveled against him by his critics. He has been accused by scholars of embellishing his accounts and exaggerating facts. By that definition, this passage is not even close to a full-fledged description, especially when we remove the supposed Christian insertions. The second argument of brevity is with reference to the stature of Jesus. If the Bible is anything to go by, then Jesus deserved an entire book or books in Josephus's writing. If Josephus wrote anything at all about Jesus, he would have written more than just 3 or 5 sentences. In contrast to the description of Jesus, Josephus goes the full 9 yards in his description of Herod, Pontius Pilate, and even John the Baptist. It can therefore safely be concluded that this passage in no way fits Josephus's style of writing prose. The second reason to doubt the authenticity of this passage in its entirety is the abrupt introduction of it. For examining this reason, I will have to examine the preceding as well as the following verses, so please bear with me. As I mentioned, the TF is found in verses 63 and 64. Now, what does verse 62 talk about? It is about a public massacre of Jews by Pontius Pilate's army, who laid upon them, that is the Jews, greater blows than Pilate had commanded them. The passage ends with the escape of wounded surviving Jews, bringing their agitation to an end. The verse following the TF is verse 65, and it begins with, "About the same time also, another sad calamity put the Jews into disorder." The use of the phrase "another sad calamity" indicates that there had been an earlier calamity. Now, what does Josephus mean by another sad calamity? He means the massacre. Now, note that the TF is not about the same sect as the earlier verse. It is also not a report of a calamity, unlike the earlier verse. The TF is an unrelated digression into something positive, happy, and hopeful about a completely new religious sect, that is the Christians, that hasn't been spoken of anywhere else earlier to this. Josephus does not even explain why he digressed for just a brief moment and quickly returned to the Jewish calamities again in verse 65. That is very non-Josephine in style. Starting in verse 65, Josephus describes about a pagan controversy, which is a much trivial affair compared to Jesus' miracles and death-defying report. Yet, the pagan affair gets 5 times more space than the Jesus affair. That again is not Josephus' style. Whether pagan Isis or Christian Jesus, Josephus could not have helped breaking into a detail about them. The third reason why its authenticity has been doubted is because of its lack of mention by everybody that wrote on the subject prior to the 4th century. That's right. Both Christian and pagan writers of early centuries of the Common Era seemed to have known nothing about the TF. The silence of pagan writers isn't so much of a surprise. But isn't it surprising that Christian writers who were committed to validating Jesus' earthly life do not refer to this passage, even in contexts where it would have been advantageous to the cause they were working for to mention it? For example, Theophilus in the 2nd century, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Julius Africanus, Tertullian, Hippolytus, and Origen in the 3rd century, and Methodius in the early 4th century. All of them knew Josephus and his works, and they also cited from his works extensively. And one would imagine that it would be the first passage that a Christian apologist would cite. Interestingly, even though the TF was published as early as 93 CE, it wasn't discovered until the 4th century, a good 200 years after it was written. And not so surprisingly, the person who discovered it was none other than the church historian Eusebius. The most shocking of all silences is that of Origen's. Now, who is Origen and why should he have known about the TF? Origen was the most important theologian and biblical scholar of the early Greek church. He lived between 185 and 254 CE. Around 245 CE, Origen wrote a treatise called Contra Celsum, or Against Celsus. Now, who was Celsus? Celsus was a 2nd century Jesus critic who wrote the True Doctrine or Discourse. In Greek, it is Alethis Logos. In this volume, Celsus argued that Jesus had a disreputable birth, a low and ordinary life, and a pointless death. Origen made a point-by-point counter to every one of Celsus's objections. He used the New Testament Gospel accounts and the letter of Paul, and even cited Josephus several times, but never once mentioned the TF. The only proofs Origen is able to present from Josephus's writings are passages on John the Baptist and James. Origen would not have missed the opportunity to present the TF as a pagan authentication of Jesus' miracle-working and death-defying power, had he known about its existence. And while on Celsus, let me also note that he was a Greek writer, writing in the 170s of the Common Era. Celsus criticized Christianity as a threat to the stable communities and worldview that the pagan religious and social system sought to uphold. Even though his work as a whole has been lost, interestingly, it has been preserved in Origen's work. If not anything, Celsus would have quoted the TF at least to criticize it, as he did every claim about Jesus by Christians. And if Celsus had made a mention of the TF, Origen would have picked it up at least to counter it. But Origen reports nothing like that from Celsus, which means Celsus made no reference to it. Isn't that odd for a critic like Celsus? So who wrote the TF? There's only a conjecture like many other crucial aspects of Christianity. But linguistic evidence points to Eusebius. Apologists may deny this. And the debate continues, like the debate of Jesus' historicity itself. Now, I will leave you with a quote from Louis H. Feldman, He is a scholar of Hellenistic civilization, specifically of the works of Josephus Flavius. Origen, who certainly knew Book 18 of the Antiquities and cites 5 passages from it, explicitly states that the wonder is that though he did not admit our Jesus to be Christ, he nonetheless gave witness to so much righteousness in James, and again he clearly states that he, Josephus, believed in Jesus as Christ. It is not until circa 224 that Eusebius cites the Testimonium on 3 occasions. Even after him, we may note Basil, Ambrose, and Josephus in the 4th century, and Vegetius, Panodorus, John Chrysostom in the 5th century often cite Josephus but not the Testimonium. And in fact, in the early 5th century, only Jerome does so. Thanks for joining me. Namaste.